The video will consist of 3 parts. First, we will tell you what this Sahel corridor is that Russia is cutting through in Africa. Next, we will show how huge this Sahel corridor really is. And finally, we will explain why Russia is cutting into Africa and around the world if our own territory has not been developed yet. Let's start with what is this Sahel corridor that Russia is cutting a window in Africa. Peter the Great cut a window to Europe, and Putin is cutting a Sahelian corridor. So that's the wording for you. Perhaps you haven't heard this phrase yet. So in a nutshell, Sahel is a geographical region meaning the south of the Sahara, hence the consonants of the names. It is a place where the desert smoothly passes into equatorial forests. The Sahel is clearly visible on the rainfall map of Africa. The Sahel is a typical savanna. It is no longer as dry as the desert, but it is not yet as humid as the equator. That is, unlike the main part of the Sahara, it is quite possible to live in the Sahel. Therefore, the region is also well visible on the map of population density in Africa. North of it, there is practically no life. Here is the map. The more saturated the color, the more people. The above dotted lines are just a schematic representation, but in general, from the point of view of geography, the Sahel looks like this. Directly under the Sahel corridor is meant the land section between the Red Sea and the Atlantic Ocean in the area of Senegal. And this corridor is meant, in the sense of a transportation route, as one of the alternatives to sea routes through Africa. Of course, there is no transportation infrastructure there yet. Moreover, there is no order and stability in these countries, civil wars, coups, and so on. However, here is an interesting pattern. Most of these Sahel countries have undergone fundamental political changes in recent years. These countries are literally throwing out pro-Western authorities and putting in pro-Russian or pro-Chinese authorities. Also, military contingents of NATO countries, the United States and France, are being actively expelled from there. And instead they invite Russian forces, the so-called African Corps. Here are the key countries of the region: Eritrea, Sudan, Chad, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Senegal. I think you've heard about each of them in the news. Recently, they all seem to have revived and stirred up, and some of them have almost become direct allies of Russia. In Eritrea and Sudan, for example, there are plans to build Russian naval bases, and the nigger is literally calling on Russia to protect him from the West. And Russia is actively intervening, and not just militarily. For several years now, we have been talking about big projects of Russian companies in the regions, gas pipelines, railroads, and so on. When the corridor is built, we will have the shortest route through Africa between the 2 hemispheres, between East and West. You can even fantasize here. In 2074, the Sahel is built up with Russian nuclear power plants that get uranium from African deposits. These nuclear power plants feed high-speed railroads that transport goods from Eritrea to Senegal at 500 kilometers per hour, cutting the journey around Africa in a matter of weeks. And nearby is an 8-lane high-speed highway where unmanned trucks pull entire road trains in both directions. The trucks are electric, so there's no exhaust. But there is a demand for energy from nuclear power stations. Along the roads, life in Africa has blossomed. Whole trading cities have grown, plantations, factories, and plants have been built. All of this has convenient access to 2 oceans at once. Africa surpasses even the United States in economic potential, and all this under the careful control of Russia and China. Or maybe they'll have their own macro region with brains somewhere in South Africa. It doesn't matter. What is important is that Putin and the NIA have announced that they are plotting changes that haven't happened in 100 years. And that's one of the optimistic scenarios. Now consider how huge this Sahel corridor that Russia is building in Africa really is. When you look at a world map, the Sahel corridor does not look like anything particularly grandiose. It's just a relatively small strip on the world map. And even if we say that this strip is 6,000 kilometers long from edge to edge, from Eritrea to Senegal, it will do little in terms of clarity. All because the Sahel is located near the equator, and as you know, the standard image of the world map has a distortion due to the transfer of the ball on the plane. So objects at the equator seem to be compressed, and closer to the poles seem to be stretched. This is what a 6,000 kilometer strip would look like at the latitudes of Moscow. Yes, it's hard to believe, but from Belarus to the Sea of Okhotsk is just about 6,000 kilometers in a straight line. Or you can go the other way and move Russia from the north to the south. That's how it will shrink there. If you don't believe me, go to the nearest globe and make sure that these 2 lines are the same length. So the path from Eritrea to Senegal is about as straight as a straight line from Khabarovsk to St. Petersburg. It seems very far. And yes, it is. But it's still closer than sailing around Africa. To go around the Sahel corridor from the south is 15,000 kilometers, from the north, almost 10,000, and that's through the Suez Canal and Gibraltar, controlled by the west. And you will have to go around it with the speed of a sea vessel, while the Sahel can be traveled by train and with a breeze. I also like this comparison. What will happen if we transfer the Sahel countries to the map of Russia? You can estimate for yourself how huge these countries are. So, for example, even Senegal, which looks tiny on the general map, actually extends from St. Petersburg to Moscow and exceeds the area of the entire Baltic states taken together. And that's just Senegal. 4 countries in the region have an area of over 1 million square kilometers. Mali 1.24 million square kilometers, Niger 1.28 million, Chad 1.28 million, Sudan 1.87 million. In total, all 7 main Sahel countries have an area of almost 6.3 million square kilometers. That's 1.5 times the size of the entire European Union, or almost as big as one Australia, or about 1/3 of Russia. In general, the region is vast, incredibly rich in resources, territories, and, incidentally, people. The total population of these 7 countries is 156 million people. Yes, it's not India, but it's more than the population of Russia. And if we add other African countries loyal to Russia, we can overtake the US and even Europe in population. Some will argue that this is of little use, because the population there is poor and insolvent. But there is one weighty argument on this subject. Poor population is the golden resource of the future, and it's not about cheap labor, not at all. Now let us consider why Russia is venturing into Africa and around the world. If our own territory has not yet been developed, there is a simple explanation. Once in the comments, one person raised an interesting topic. Russia is going into Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and so on. But why? Is it a priority? We have few problems inside the country. The country covers 17.5 million square kilometers. Hardly 10% of this territory is fully equipped for life. Not everywhere has normal roads, jobs, gas. Why build roads in Africa if we don't have enough roads ourselves? Or why is Russian Railways going to build a railroad somewhere in Burkina Faso? Although in Crimea we still have trains from Kerch to Simferopol via Dzhankoy, and no direct road has been built. And this grandiose project of a gas pipeline across the Sahara, do we need it? Maybe it is better to gasify 100% of Siberia? As you can see, it is not difficult to ask such open questions, even if I call them populist. In general, it is not difficult to answer them either. So let's get started. There is no other way. You can dig for a long time in the history of human development, but you will hardly find an example when a country has achieved any internal development without actively directing its forces outward. First of all, we are talking about trade. It's a Yumi scheme, colonization. That's the Yumi scheme. But is it that Europe became so rich and prosperous because it was so closed in on itself and didn't interfere? No, not at all. Not at all. Europe went wherever it could. Half of the world, and even more, was a colony of European powers. They brought the wealth of the whole world to them for nothing. And yes, under such conditions it is possible to build on its territory beautiful castles, palaces, roads, and bridges, which are so admired by tourists. Or maybe the US doesn't meddle with anything and deals exclusively with itself. This sounds like some kind of anecdote. Maybe the Soviet Union didn't go anywhere? Not in Cuba, not in Africa, not in Vietnam, not in Eastern Europe, not anywhere at all. Even if you take some super closed country, like Japan, suddenly it turns out that it trades with half the world. Toyotas and Nissans drive even in the last African village. And Japanese household appliances once penetrated even the mountainous Pakistani villages. The Japanese came to us here and proposed various projects on mining, garbage processing, construction of factories, and so on. Why don't they sit on the islands? Why do they meddle everywhere? These Japanese? Because they can't do it any other way. Tiny Venice became incredibly rich because it traded with the whole world. Merchants of Venice. It's just a stable expression. Russia will not be able to settle itself without promoting its interests around the world. Resources should flow here, and I am not just talking about minerals, but in the broadest sense up to human capital. But they won't do it themselves. We need to go to Africa with our feet and do something there with our hands so that Africa opens the faucet and the flow of mutually beneficial trade will open between our countries. Next, let's look at the window of opportunity. Let's take Tomsk as an example. Until the 19th century, it was the capital of all of Siberia. And Siberia at that time included northern Kazakhstan. It was really Siberian Athens or Siberian Moscow, a developed city in the middle of the taiga. However, then mankind invented the railroad, and the Russian Empire began to pull this road from the European part to the far east. The shortest route lay 200 kilometers south of Tomsk. This path crossed the Ob River together under the name of Novaya Village or Yusevka. Ideally, Tomsk merchants could have splurged and allocated money to build the railroad through Tomsk, but they apparently did not understand, did not see the potential of the railroad. Back then, it was as progressive as artificial intelligence is now. If you tell an official about artificial intelligence, he will say, "What artificial intelligence? I need to build kindergartens and hospitals." And he will be right in his own way. And I do not want to praise artificial intelligence now. It's just as an example. But the window of opportunity will be missed. The Tomsk merchants of the 19th century missed that window. The railroad passed Tomsk through a village unknown to anyone. Today, Tomsk is a relatively small provincial town. Yes, beautiful. Yes, university. But the new village was soon renamed to the village of Alexandrovsky, then to the city of Novonikolayevsk, and then to the city of Novosibirsk, and today it is the third most populous city in Russia, the capital of Siberia. Krasnoyarsk people will argue, but it's a long-standing dispute. grown essentially from a tiny village, thanks to the railroad, and Tomsk stands in a railroad cul-de-sac. So the window of opportunity can't stay open forever. It has to be seized here and now, or it's too late. The redistribution of the world is happening right now, right as you're listening to this video. So you can't just get away from everything and take care of yourself. It will be too late. We've already missed the previous redistribution of the world, the age of the great geographical discoveries, when the West colonized the planet. But we can't miss this train. Yes, we are not talking about colonizing Africa, but the first option of cooperation, of mutually beneficial trade. You give me, I give you. Africa must necessarily be, if not all of it, under our wing. But in most of its part, it will not be possible to develop our 17 million square kilometers in any other way.